Hello and welcome to Latika Takes, a podcast with me, Latika Burke.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I'm Latika Burke, and this week we will be deep diving into Canadian politics. I have to confess, I'm the first to admit that I have not really, during my lifetime, paid a great deal of attention to Canadian politics. And I think it's fair to say that might be a reflection shared by a lot of you. Until, of course, the last few months, when Donald Trump has just put Canada on the global stage in a way Canada may have been incapable of doing itself. And Donald Trump has, of course, caused huge disruption in the United States and around the world. But it looks like he could be on the cusp of transforming Canadian politics, transforming Canadian foreign policy. And I think, and I suspect, and you'll hear a bit more of this in the podcast, transforming politics around the world. Some of the trends that I've been discussing on my Substack here over the last few months, I think we're coming to revise some of those theories. So this is a fascinating episode. So joining me to discuss all of this and a lot more is David Coletto. David Coletto is head of Abacus Data and one of Canada's, if not Canada's, top pollster. And you might remember in my What I'm Reading Canada edition, I included some research from Abacus Data and put in some really clever ways that Coletto's firm was asking Canadian voters how they felt about their leaders. Things like, who would you trust to put up a shelf? I thought that was a really interesting way of asking questions to get at who people might vote for when they ordinarily might not say or even know within themselves. And if you appreciated that, you will love this episode because he asks a brilliant question about Trump in a way that is super revealing of how Canadians might vote. So listen for that. It is worth it. Okay, before we get into it, just a reminder that this podcast, this episode, is brought to you by Political Tours, run by former New York Times and BBC correspondent Nicholas Wood. You can find them at politicaltours.com. It's a way to travel intelligently. You will be taken to countries and you will get under its political skin, meeting the movers and shakers. Nicholas Wood came up with this idea when he was a globe-trotting correspondent too, and he correctly assessed that there would be travellers with a serious interest in current affairs who wanted to match the two. Political Tours is heading to Taiwan later this year, and in June they're heading to Ireland, looking at the possibility of a united Ireland. And on that trip, you can meet leaders of all sides and quiz members of ex-paramilitary groups and so on. politicaltours.com. Tell Nick and Karen that I recommended you.
All right, well, let's get into it. Just for context, this interview was recorded just before Mark Carney called Canada's snap election. David Coletto, welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay, where to start? I think right at the beginning, because the last time, pre-Trump, before I checked into Canadian politics, Pierre Poilievre looked set to cruise to victory. He was 20 points ahead in the polls. Justin Trudeau had turned himself into this rather unlikable figure, both at home and increasingly overseas. What happened?
Well, I think a few things happened in a very short period of time. One is our deputy prime minister at the time, Chrystia Freeland, and finance minister resigned at the end of December, just before the holidays, that basically, I think, finished off Justin Trudeau, who then resigned or announced his resignation a few weeks later. And then a few weeks after that, Donald Trump was inaugurated as president of the United States again and started making repeated threats, not just about the tariffs, which would do economic damage to Canada and any other country that he's threatening, but more to Canada, given our very close economic relationship. But he started to repeat over and over his dream of seeing Canada become the 51st state, talking about arbitrary borders. And so you had that with Trudeau quitting and the emergence of Mark Carney, our former governor of our central bank and the former Bank of England governor, basically easily winning a leadership, created an environment where the Liberal Party no longer holding back possible supporters. People who voted for the party in the past had been leaving them in record numbers, hence the lowest numbers we'd seen in a very long time for that party. They became comfortable with the idea because Trudeau was gone. But then their mindset shifted pretty much overnight when we were less concerned about how am I going to pay the rent or the grocery bill, and much more focused on the existential threat of will we even be a country anymore? And what is the economic damage going to mean for me? And so what I've described it as the shift from scarcity to precarity meant that the job I think people are going to be hiring for in our federal election in terms of our prime minister and our leaders changed rapidly. And that created the space for the Liberal Party to go from people questioning whether it would even be the third or fourth party in our House of Commons to now many people believe the favorite to win this election.
That is insane, that level of turnaround. I mean, have you ever witnessed anything like that in politics?
I haven't. We always point to in Canada, the early 90s, we had a similar changeover where an unpopular Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, who had been in office for close to 8 years, was replaced by our first female Prime Minister, Kim Campbell, who, very quickly, the polls, shot up. Some described her as the most popular Prime Minister we've ever had. And then, and this is where we don't know the end of this story that we're living through right now, she ended up with the worst result that the party that she led ever had, with only 2 seats in our House of Commons and basically the party on death's door. I don't think Mark Carney is believing that's how this is going to end. And I don't know if we can say history is going to repeat itself. But the speed at which this political situation has changed, I think, is not just remarkable from a Canadian historical perspective, but I am hard pressed to find any example in any democracy where we've seen this kind of just wholesale shift. And it makes sense. I mean, maybe during a war, during the pandemic, I think you saw people rally around the flag and incumbents' popularity go up. But you basically are in a situation now where there are millions of Canadians who were saying to me as a pollster, under no circumstances would I vote Liberal, to now being like, no, I'm not only open to voting Liberal, I think I'm going to do that.
Is this a bit unfair to Pierre Poilievre? Because from what I've read and seen of his statements, he's not exactly pro-Trump, and he certainly doesn't support Trump annexing Canada. And Doug Ford, I think the Ontario governor, has been one of the most strident anti-Trump people, and he's conservative, right? So how come it's so negative for Poilievre when he's not sharing Trump's views?
Well, I think it's all about perception, and I would agree. I don't think most acute observers of Canadian politics would say that both his policies and overall in his demeanor that Pierre Poilievre is a Trump-like character. Although when you're under threat by a man like this, any perception that you either cheered him on when he was running, share some of his worldviews, or, and this is the challenge he faces, have a caucus of members of parliament who in the past have worn MAGA hats and have cheered on. We had this convoy in Ottawa. I don't know if you recall, a few years ago, I live in Ottawa, where they basically, about a bunch of truckers came into our capital and took over the city for a number of weeks. Pierre Poilievre went and handed out donuts and cheered them on. So he's had this complicated image that when Justin Trudeau was prime minister, people were willing to look past because they simply wanted a change in government. And he reflected the frustration and the anger that people were feeling really, really well. But today, I think Donald Trump is his kryptonite. Donald Trump divides the Conservative coalition. You've got a quarter of Conservative supporters who like Donald Trump still in Canada, which is a tiny minority these days, but almost all of them are Conservative supporters. But then you also have 3/4 of his base who aren't Trump supporters. And so he went from having this unifying force, Justin Trudeau, to having this thing that I think is splitting his coalition and requiring him to navigate it carefully. If he's too hard on Trump, he risks alienating that small minority. If he's not hard enough, he will risk the larger audience that says, we want you to stand up to this guy. We want you to be unequivocal. And I agree. I think he's tried to be, but there's still this feeling. It was an interesting, one more thing. I asked a question on a survey. Who do you think Pierre Poilievre would have voted for in the US presidential election? A majority of Canadians thought he would have voted for Donald Trump. And so that's the perceptual problem, right? Reality doesn't matter in my world, in the world of politics. It's what people think that matters the most.
That's a fascinating way to ask that question. That's really clever. This is a really similar dynamic that's happening in Australia. I just got here this week. I spent 8 years reporting on federal politics here. I live in London, but now back in Australia for a couple of months. And Peter Dutton, who's the Liberal Conservative in Australia leader,
Yeah.
he did a few dancing or dalliances with Trumpism, and it's all just starting to bite him now. And he was polling neck and neck, and now he's started to retreat a bit. And it leads me to wonder if a couple of months ago, and I indeed wrote a piece about this, the question was whether one-term left-leaning governments were a thing, whether
Mhm.
Biden was a one-term government, Schultz was a one-term government. We're maybe looking at Albanese in Australia being a one-term Labor government. And then, of course, the end of Liberals in Canada in such spectacular fashion. I now wonder, is MAGA making incumbency great again?
You were reading my mind, because I think 2024 was the year of the anti-incumbent, right? And the Financial Times did a really interesting piece on that. 105 years, not a single year except 2024 where every government nationally or globally faced an electorate lost support. I do think incumbency has advantages now in a world where people are looking for stability. They're looking for sensible government. And that doesn't necessarily need to be of a left-leaning government, but it needs to be one that seems in control, seems calm, right? And so, again, a Keir Starmer, who was on his way, has only been in office for a few months in the UK, was already in deep trouble. And if you want to see a perfect example, where I know we're talking UK politics now, just very briefly, Nigel Farage, who's the leader of
Yeah.
the Reform Party, their populist conservative option, was a mega lover only a few months ago, has retreated from some of his positions, knowing how unpopular they would make it and make him unpalatable to so many Brits. The same phenomenon, I think, is going to happen globally. Now, that didn't affect the German election, but I think it was too soon, right? Like, I think
Yes.
this is just really accelerated in the last few weeks as Trump has expanded his threats beyond North America and China. He's now threatening reciprocal tariffs on everybody. And so there's no one, maybe except Vladimir Putin, who's getting off easy in the Trump world right now.
I suspect that the turning point was the Zelensky Oval Office. So since I've got back to Australia, I caught up with a couple of cabinet ministers, and they have told me that actually the tide really felt like it started to turn back in their favour after that Oval Office blow up. Something really crystallised in people's minds about how they viewed America and what side people were perceived to be on. So I don't know, but you're
No,
the
that
data
is,
guy.
I think
You'll be able
that
to
makes
check that
complete
out.
sense now that you say it. And I hadn't thought of it until now, because it was a perfect visualization.
Yeah.
And the visuals matter so much, right? And to see that office, which for most people's lives have been that place where, like, the Americans, we can always disagree on some things, but there was always this stabilizing force. It was that for Australians, for Canadian, for us, like-minded, democratic, particularly English-speaking countries, there's a sense of stability that the United States continually provided. And now we've lost that. And so I think we're starting to seek it again in our own leaders. And we're less, again, in the Canadian mindset, for 2 years, we were pretty down on our own country. Most Canadians agreed Canada was broken. We couldn't get things right. We couldn't build things. The cost of everything was going out of control. A lot of parallels maybe with Australia, I think, in some ways. But all of a sudden, the moment we were under attack, you drive down my neighborhood, there are more Canadian flags out in front of people's homes than on our national holiday, which is where you typically see them, right? I'm wearing a Canadian
I
pin,
can
and
see.
I'm doing it out of sheer pride. And that wasn't there, not because I wasn't proud of Canada, but I wasn't activated now. And that changes our politics too.
So, how serious is this anti American sentiment? Do you think it's a deep scarring that Trump is creating here? Or do you think Canadians, if Trump were not the president in a couple of years, Canadians would be willing to say, look, that was a really crazy brief moment in time, but we're all good now? Or do you think this is going to set Canada on some different path internationally?
Well, I think initially people looked at what was going on and said, that's a one man's decision. So we're not going to be mad at Americans. We're going to be angry at him. But I do think the longer this goes on and the more that Canadians ask themselves, why aren't you stopping this? Why aren't you
Yeah.
calling your Congress people? Why aren't you? And we're starting to see it. There is evidence in even some town hall meetings with Republican Congress people where even constituents are coming and almost defending Canada in really interesting ways that it might be happening. But I think a few things are going on. I mean, almost half of Canadians say in our most recent survey they would absolutely do everything they can not to buy anything that is American made. We see immense decline in travel to the United States. I mean, you don't understand as an Australian, but you've lived in the UK, but still, you don't understand Canadian winters. We travel south. Like the US is a destination for a few months a year. Many thousands of Canadians decided not to do that this year as kind of payback for what they feel is a deep betrayal. Does it hold post-Trump? What I've learned from consumer and general behavior is like once you change your habits, they stick. And I think this has certainly harmed the relationship between Canada and the United States, between Canadians and Americans. Is it irreparable? I don't think so. I think you can always rebuild it, but it's scarred and it's created the public opinion space for our leaders to now explore alternatives. We released a poll last week that showed more Canadians open to joining the EU than not. And when asked, the EU, I think foreign commissioner was here in Canada and said, thank you, but no, you're not a European country. We have more people now talking about how we, Australians and Canadians and New Zealanders and Kiwis should form an alliance, right? And with the UK and others, build this like alternative Anglo alliance. So I think that's also creating political space for that to happen in a way that it may not have been vogue or as interesting before.
On a more serious note, though, I imagine your economy is so deeply intertwined with the United States. If a boycott were to hold up, could you actually sustain that?
Well, it's hard, right? So a boycott of American goods, we could probably sustain it because we've already seen suppliers looking elsewhere. So most of the year, if I was going to get strawberries in the winter, they were likely coming from California. And now I notice they're from Mexico or they're from other Southern American
Right. It's
countries.
happening that soon.
It's already
The change
happening.
is happening.
The
Wow.
retailers are moving. They're putting signage up that signals what's Canadian and what would be affected by tariffs. Where I think the biggest economic effect, though, is if he does end up putting widespread tariffs on more than just what he's done so far, the economic impact is pretty severe. Our economies are so integrated. A car that's made in Canada, the parts might travel back and forth over the border a few times. That's just one example of just how integrated. I do some work for the food sector in Canada. I didn't even know this, but 70% of the grocery items in a typical Canadian grocery store are made in the United States. So think of the middle aisles. I don't know if it's the same in Australia, but like all the packaged goods.
Yep.
We don't manufacture much of that in Canada. We rely on an integrated supply chain. So it's going to create some longer term disruption, no doubt. And if he does implement those tariffs, huge economic disruption. But the opposite upside of it is it's for the first time in a long time in my life living here in Canada, we're starting to talk about owning our own future, which is creating opportunities, I think, again, for us to talk about, well, why aren't we manufacturing more of our food here? Why aren't we trading with other countries? I mean, we have a free trade agreement with Europe that they haven't ratified. Let's get on with it. And so that, again, with every crisis comes a new opportunity. As you're going to see, Latika, I'm a glass half full kind of person. So despite everything,
I think it's important in our jobs to be glass half full, to be honest. And I think you're right. There are always opportunities to these big changes. So I'm really intrigued about Mark Carney because he is everything that we're told people don't love in politicians anymore. He's a central banker. He's an elitist. He's definitely a globalist. I mean, I was in the UK when Brexit happened and he was the central banker at the time and became this hate figure of the Leave campaign because he kept warning about the economic damage that Brexit would do to the UK. So is Canada just different? Do you guys still have a tolerance for elitists and globalists? Or back to my earlier question about Trump making incumbency great again, is Trump also making elitism great again?
I think he might be. So here's my theory. I think that if Kamala Harris was president of the United States today, I don't think Mark Carney would have much audience. In fact, I don't think Justin Trudeau would have quit. But I don't think in the world that we were in 3 months ago, that all, as you described, a central banker who used to work at Goldman Sachs, who has very rich and powerful friends, who travels and probably stays at the nicest hotels in the world and has lots of money, would have a hard time connecting with an electorate that was feeling, again, that scarcity mindset. But in this environment, the way I've kind of described what Mark Carney is and why he might find a lot of appeal, and he is finding a lot of appeal, is he is that, like, and I don't know if cancer has been in your life like it's been in mine, not personally, but in family, but I still think of like that oncologist who, if you are diagnosed with cancer, you want the very best oncologist who has the very best training and has the very best techniques in medicine. And you also want somebody who's going to hold your hand and tell you, I'm here, I've been here before, I'm going to get us through this. And I honestly think if Mark Carney plays that card in that way, people will look past his wealth, they'll look past his elitism, and they might realize we actually want an elite. And that's different than elitist. I want somebody who went to Harvard and to Oxford and had all the best training in all the world and is going to get us through this. And in contrast to Pierre Poilievre, who has been an MP for 20 plus years, but has not held many executive level positions, that's a sharp contrast. And Pierre Poilievre, as you described, doesn't come off as warm and comforting. He is the litigator. He is the trial lawyer who can tap into the emotion of the jury, but has a hard time showing, I think, compassion. And
interesting, because I thought he was a very good communicator. I saw that clip that went viral when he was munching the apple and telling off the journalist. It was actually
he's
very
great,
good.
but when the mood needs that kind of guy, he was made for the moment in 2024. Trump destroyed, I think, that environment for him, which is why I think this week Trump was out saying he hopes the Liberals win and tried to dissuade his connection at all with Poilievre.
So, as I understood it, housing, immigration, cost of living, same issues here, same issues in the UK election. They were going to be your dominant everyday hip pocket issues that people were willing to vote on just a few weeks ago.
They're still high up. Cost of living is still the number one issue when we ask people to give them a long list and say pick three. But Trump has now eclipsed everything else except that and is only 10 points behind it. And so those are still on people's minds. But I think what Trump and his threats have done is they've made people, instead of look back and say, who do I blame for why my life feels so hard right now? And instead they're worried about who's going to stop him from making all that stuff worse. And it's a simple shift in mindset, but it changes our political behavior and our political opinions. And so those are still issues. Canada's population grew rapidly. Views on immigration basically changed within a year. It's crazy. Canadians always used to think, we don't debate immigration. We're not like everybody else. No, we're like everybody else. When that sense of scarcity emerges, this election's about to start. I think the first few days are going to be a battle, like many elections are, about setting what the ballot question is. What is the question voters are going to answer by voting? And I think we've seen over the last 3 weeks that Trump and responding to Trump has really moved fast up the list, but there's still a desire for change. The Liberals have still been in office for 10 years. They are still looking for their fourth mandate. And so that is, I think, the other side of the emotional coin. But we're not going to be debating policy. I don't think we're going to be debating big, grand plans. It's who do I trust to deal with Trump, or which option, how do I get the change that I'm looking to see?
Yeah, so in Australia a decade ago, when I was in Canberra reporting on politics, you may or not be aware, we went through about 5 or 6 prime ministers in rapid time. So now there's this huge fear about changing leaders again. And actually, it's really interesting because the current Labor leader, he has been behind in the polls until this Trump effect came into play. We're going to an election in a couple of days too. But the party is so scarred by changing leaders, they're like adamant they will not do it again. They'd rather lose than change a sitting prime minister again. But I wonder if this Trudeau-Carney changeover might actually reinforce there is a benefit to changing the leaders for a government that's been in power because, look, you get to actually pretend you're a new government.
Well, everybody in Canada and many MPs in that Liberal caucus were wondering, why is Trudeau holding on? What does he not see that everybody else saw? That no matter what he did, he wasn't going to convince people that they weren't going to give him a shot. I think in this moment, It really depends on who you replace the leader with, though. I think with Chrystia Freeland, who in Canada was our deputy prime minister, who quit and probably ended Justin Trudeau's career by herself, she ran against Mark Carney and got 8% of the vote in the leadership election. Mark Carney got 89%. So you need to still have someone who fits the bill. And I think Mark Carney came along at the exact perfect moment. So my advice to Labor in Australia is you may want to change your leader, but you've got to have the right person to replace him because that's what happened in Canada. I'm not sure it was just, it was essential that Justin Trudeau get replaced. But if they had replaced him with Chrystia Freeland, I'm not sure they would be in a place where they might win this year's election.
Was there a gender issue there?
I'm sure there was, but I still think it was Trudeau as kryptonite for the Liberals, that both of them were senior, prominent members of the Trudeau cabinet, and so carried a lot of the baggage that Justin Trudeau had. And Mark Carney, while he was associated with them and had been an advisor for Trudeau, didn't serve in his government. It was a fascinating leadership race because it wasn't contentious. They didn't really attack each other all that much. But in one of the only English language debates, Chrystia Freeland had to defend the economy because she was the former finance minister. And Karina Gould was actually really the status quo kind of candidate defending the record of Trudeau. Mark Carney said, no, the economy's weak and I'm going to make it stronger. And that was the signal, right? You have to be able to...
that's the Kamala Harris trap, right? She was stuck defending Biden's record, which is why she couldn't make a case for being something new.
Exactly. She couldn't articulate what change she would be. And she was too loyal to Biden for some reason, where I'm sure Trudeau doesn't love the fact that Carney's actually, by signing a piece of paper, overturning some of his most marquee policies, like our national carbon price, gone, literally.
I got to say, that really shocked me because what is that saying? Are we seeing the left now being complicit in spiking climate change policy? Is this the new future we're in? I personally think net zero is kind of gone, and some of these leaders who are clinging on to it are holding on to a dying reality that the world has materially changed when it comes to climate change policy.
I think, again, I have this theory around the scarcity mindset that when you think that the basic things you need in your life are hard to get and expensive, unfortunately, because I'm somebody who is worried about climate change, that's an issue for most people who aren't directly affected that gets pushed aside. I'll deal with that 5 years from now, right? And right now I got to figure out how to pay the rent or feed my family or whatever. And so in our polling in Canada, climate change has fallen very far down the priority list. So it's allowed even the Liberals to take one of its most marquee policies and just basically flip it and say, we're out, we're done. I still believe Carney believes in climate action and wants to take it seriously, but I think he's realized that if he hadn't done that, in his mind, you get a much worse government on climate than he would be. So it was like a necessary thing to prevent the worst outcome, which would be, in his mind, a conservative government on climate.
And just finally, David, how do Canadians receive their political communication? What's going to be the make or break way they receive their messages from Poilievre, the Conservatives, the Liberals, or Mark Carney? And is that changing as any result of MAGA and the US?
Well, that's a whole other hour, I think, conversation, because I think, and that's not a Canadian phenomenon, I think it's a global one, right? The fragmentation of our news and information ecosystem is the driver of so much of what's going on. And so the modern campaign won't reach everybody if you just rely on earned media. We did an interesting study in Canada that showed 1 in 4 Canadians under 30-year-olds say TikTok is their primary news source. We see it in how closely people are following news around Trump. If you're over 60, you are like glued to the TV because you have a TV and you have a cable subscription and you're still watching broadcast news. If you're under 40, you're probably listening to a podcast like yours. You're probably on social media and you're less engaged. You're less overwhelmed by the news. And so you're not as angry, interestingly. So from a campaign perspective, what we've seen already is Pierre Poilievre has been very good at finding very niche podcasts. Jordan Peterson, for example, I don't know if you're aware of him down under.
Yep.
He's got a very big audience with young men. And Polyev went on his podcast before the holidays, and it reached a wide audience. Like, we found like 1 in 5 Canadians knew about that interview, and
Wow.
1 in 3.
So that's like the Joe Rogan equivalent.
That's as close as Canada gets to a Joe Rogan. We don't have a big national podcasters like that, but it is highly fragmented. Interestingly, I don't know if it's true in Australia, but in Canada, I would say if you ask most campaign strategists, they would say earned media doesn't matter. It's all about paid now. And the Conservatives headed into this election have had a massive fundraising advantage. They've been spending millions and millions of dollars advertising, both before Trudeau left and now since Carney's been in, with a barrage of ads. And they're targeting everybody on YouTube and on social platforms. How people are getting their information means that most Canadians, even within the same household, may not be experiencing this campaign in the same way. And that is not new. I think that's been an evolution over the last decade. But this may be like an extreme version of how that's going to play out. And I think we underestimate the impact that that's going to have on how people perceive the campaign to be going on itself.
Okay, fascinating. Well, David, thanks for your time. I'd love to catch up with you again after the election, and we can talk about what went down and what mattered. But final question. Okay, there's a bottle of what is a national drink in Canada?
National drink is probably just beer. Like
just beer. Oh my God, that's the inner Australian coming out in you. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, something amazingly great to drink that's not beer. A bottle of this on the line. Who do you think wins?
I think Mark Carney's going to win. I know.
Big call.
And I'm the polling company that still has the Conservatives ahead. We're the outlier a little bit, but I look at the underlying numbers. I look at the underlying momentum they have, and I just feel that I feel like a wave's about to come, and that people are just uncomfortable. They just don't feel secure in Pierre Poilievre. And while they don't know Mark Carney that well, he seems harmless and safe and secure. And I think, so if I had to bet on that bottle of, and not going to be beer because I don't drink good, we'll find something better. I think Mark Carney is going to pull this one off, surprisingly.
David Coletto, thank you so much for joining the podcast. It was great to chat to you.
It was an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to Latika Takes with me, Latika Burke. You can find my work at latikambirk.com and this podcast where you find all your podcasts. See you next time.